Hello and welcome to another episode of Voices of the Diaspora. I am your host, Tilamahos, and we have a great show today. I am joined by a special guest on this episode. We're going to be talking about Hellenism. We're going to be talking about Rome, the Eastern Roman Empire, Roman identity, and our Hellenic identity, how these things relate and connect. So I am joined today by Gregory Heers. Gregory, why don't you come on out onto the stage? We'll have a bit of a discussion.
Greetings, Yasu Dilemma here.
Hello, welcome.
It's good to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's great to have you on. How are you?
Glory to God, very well. Keeping busy, but life's good.
Amazing. Why don't you tell the audience a bit about yourself and a bit about what we're going to be discussing today.
Of course. Yes, my name is Gregory Heers, as Dilemma said. Some of you may know me or have heard of me from Anchor Mountain Press, which is where I work. Um, the books we publish, the books I have worked on, and also I have appeared maybe twice on the Orthodox Ethos podcast, which is run by my father, Father Peter Heers. And history is one of my greatest passions. So today I was invited by Telemachos to join you, Telemachos, and speak about our history, the history of our people, and how uh, these two poles, Hellenism and Romanity, Romiosini. What is Romiosini? Probably most of us have heard of it. If we're Greek, I am on my mom's side, on my mother's side, I'm Greek, and also a quarter from my father, so 5/8, if you want to be technical. But what does it mean? What is Romiosini, if you've heard of that? And how does that relate to Hellenismos, Hellenism? Because in recent years, more and more people have spoke are speaking out against the term Byzantine Empire and saying that it's actually the Roman Empire or the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, which of course if that is true, then how does that affect our history? Because modern Greece traces its lineage directly back to the Eastern Roman Empire, so or the Byzantine Empire, and so that creates a lot of questions. What does it mean to say that the Byzantium was Roman? In what sense? Was it also Greek? So, and what are the origins of these names and their use to our history? And how does that affect us and our identity today? That, in a word, is what I will speak to you today about.
Yeah, no, these all sound very good. It's a very important topic, I think, especially amongst um, both in terms of being amongst Greeks and just amongst the Orthodox generally, because Rome and the Roman Empire, or Romania, if we want to say too, is very important. Like you said, like both to Greeks and also just in general, just to the Orthodox world as a whole, because and really just to Christendom, because even in the West too, they also tried to make claims to Rome and stuff as well. So it's something that from really from the beginning of Rome all the way up until maybe we can say into the beginning of the 20th century, within Christendom, there were people talking about themselves as if they either were Romans or the continuation of Rome or something like that. So this is obviously an important identity, and especially to the Greeks, um, it's been something very important to the point where even many Greeks called themselves Romans up until very very recently. Like my family specifically, is from Pondos, and my great grandparents were calling themselves Romei, right? So, and many other Greeks also have similar things. So this is obviously an important topic. Um, so why don't you? I'll let you kind of take the lead on this kind of discussion. I mean, where exactly do you think? Where would you want to begin? I mean, if you wanted to just start us out, I mean, maybe we can kind of talk about Romiosini just a little bit, and try to define some terms and stuff, so that there's not confusion or anything. We kind of can have a good idea of what we're talking about with different things.
Yes. Well, I think there's many ways to approach the topic. You can start at the end, go back, start at the beginning, go forward, or you can just start in the middle. But let's start with our modern Greek history and then work our way backwards. Since you mentioned the Ponti who called themselves Romei, and of course, it wasn't just the Ponti, it wasn't just the Pontic Greeks, but throughout all of the Ottoman Empire, all the Greeks called themselves Romei or Romi, and Romi is just a colloquial version of Romei. If somebody wanted, if somebody were trying to create a distinction between Romios and Romeos, that is, I'll tell you, that is purely arbitrary. There is as much of a distinction between Romios and Romeos as there is between Turkia and Turkia, or between Evraikos and Evraikos. It's just a dialectical, a, a difference in dialect, not a difference in meaning. In other words, and that's why when you read books, for example, the Lives of the New Martyrs, written by Saint Nicodemus around the year 1800, in there they say the Turks arrest a new martyr, and as they're interrogating him, or in the course of the account, you see that either the Turks say that you are a Romeos, or he says I am a Romeos, but in the spoken word he would have said Romeos probably, because it was colloquial. So there's no distinction there. So the reality is that our direct ancestors, as Greeks, up until even as late as 100, but especially 200 years ago, up until the Greek Revolution, universally called themselves Romans. That's what Romeos means. So the question is, what did that mean? Of course, they use other words too in specific contexts. The other terms were Grekos. Grekos is the main other word, and Grekos though was used, of course, by the West, which calls us to this day Greeks, not Hellenes. And we'll see there are specific contexts in which Grekos is used more, but Romeos and Romeos were indisputably the primary name, and that all changed with the Greek Revolution, because once the Greek state was the modern Greek kingdom, and later on republic was established, they called it Ελληνική Δημοκρατία or Ελληνική Πολιτεία, or the king was King Βασιλεύς των Ελλήνων. So then you see all this Hellenic terminology become predominant, and the Romaic terminology is nowhere to be found. In the Greek, in the modern Greek state, of course, in the Ottoman Empire, the legal terminology continued to refer to our brothers in the Ottoman Empire as Rum or Rumlar, which means Romans. And some people have the impression that, oh, that's what the Turks called us. That wasn't really our name, and that's mistaken. Of course, the Turks called us that, but that they called us that because that's what we called ourselves to begin with. So, and so other people say that we called ourselves that because we had been citizens of the Roman Empire for 1,500 years, or actually it's more like 1,600 years if you count BC. But we said that, but it just meant Hellenes, just meant Hellenes. It was just just it's like saying what's a good analogy? You say Romios, but what you really mean is Hellenes. You don't mean Roman in Italy. Now, here's the problem with this matter, and Telemachia, feel free to interrupt me at any point if you want to have something to interject. But we are dealing with a history that is at least 2,500 years, and possibly more, depending how far back you want to go. And these words, the key words, Hellene, Romeos, or Roman, Hellene, Greek, Grekos, and or Byzantine, which is of course much rarer. in the primary sources have been used in a dozen different contexts in different time periods. And so to take one example and then say this is what it meant for all of these 2000 plus years is of course will of course be mistaken. So let's go back.
Here's maybe a good question to this kind of point where you were saying the term Roman, because some people say that, like, as you just said, that like Roman just meant Hellene. It was just another word for it. Do we see the term Roman being applied to the other Orthodox peoples of the Balkans, or is it only to the Greeks? And then in the terms of language, because obviously, or well, I shouldn't say obviously, but what we call now Elnica, were they calling it Romaica? And then what about, Serbian and Romanian and Albanian, whatever these other languages around?
Right.
Were they also calling that Roman, or were they calling it something else? And not just language, but the ethnicities, because obviously these people were there all around us, and so were we. I mean, how did they distinguish amongst themselves, or did they not?
Yes. That is a very good question. I'm glad you asked, because while the Ottomans did refer to all the Orthodox as Rum, in fact, there's a martyrdom in that lives in the Synaxarion of the New Mars that I mentioned. There's a life of a Russian who was martyred, and the Turks called him a Romeos, even though he was Russian. But the Orthodox peoples themselves did not call all of themselves Romans. In other words, the Serbs, in fact, specifically the Serbs, were so much that did they not identify as Romans, that they wanted to have their own patriarchate, because in the Ottoman system, all the inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire were classified by religion into four nations, millet, which were of course based on religion: the Turkish millet, which was the Muslims; the Roman millet, which was Rum millet, which was the Orthodox, whether they were Romans or Greeks, or Serbians, or Romanians / Vlachs, or Bulgarians. Then there was the Armenian millet for the Monophysites, and the Jewish millet. And then later on, there were some minor millets like the Frankish, but they were never. Well, actually, I don't think there ever was a Frankish millet. Take that back. But later on, at one point, the Serbs wanted to have their own patriarchate, because that would mean they would have their own millet, and thereby be recognized as a separate nation. Because the Ottomans, which is not canonical, but they did that because they didn't care about the canons, they subordinated all the local churches to the ecumenical patriarchate. Even the patriarchates of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, which are supposed to be equal, although not equal in honor, they come second and third in rank, but they are independent patriarchates. Yet in practice, in the Ottoman Empire, they were subordinated to the ecumenical patriarch, because the Turks wanted to have a single ethnarch, a single leader of this millet, to be responsible and to be a reference point, to mediate between these people and the Sultan. So when the Serbs I think it was in the 17th century, they tried very hard and they got their own millet for only a few decades. Then it was revoked. But to have their own patriarchate meant to have their own millet and to be recognized as a separate nation. So they did not consider themselves Rum. And the Bulgarians later on, much later in the 19th century, of course, they had their own national awakening. With the results are pretty well known in the Greek world. We had the Macedonian struggle, and which is, of course, from an Orthodox perspective, unfortunate to have Orthodox nations at each other's throats. But yes, I think that answers your questions, though. So they called us all Rum. We did not, though, which means that Rum was not just a religious term; it was an ethnic term. And now, of course, because of ignorance, because the people were not educated, there were no schools, by and large, with some exceptions, but there were a few educated. There were a few schools here and there, and there were some mostly clerics or merchants who had some education. But if you don't think about it, if you're never taught your history, you so when you say I'm Greek, what comes to your mind? You, Tiamat, let's
Well,
say.
definitely our history is one of the biggest things, and of course other things as well, like our culture, religion, food, and place, style of dress, all that, the way we look. But definitely our history is a very big one.
Right. So you might think you said the place we live. So you might think of our country, obviously Greece, and our flag, right? But
Hmm.
if you're in the Ottoman Empire, you don't have a flag. The place you live is also the place where Jews and Muslims live, and your customs, honestly, are not. There are differences, but at face value, the clothes you wear and the music you listen to is not black and black and white. It's not so drastically different. Here in the West, Greek music is very different from American or whatever French,
Hmm.
English music, folk music. But in the Balkans, Greek folk music and other Balkan folk music are very similar. So it's and history is very important. All that to say, and if you don't know any history except whatever oral memory was passed down, and that's why the fall of Constantinople and the Marble Emperor was a huge rallying point, because everything that came before, glorious epics like Justinian, Belisarius, Basil the Bulgar Slayer, Nicephorus Phocas, and of course, even more so, Pericles, Alexander. Alexander the Great was an exception because he was so famous that he was never forgotten. But besides Alexander the Great, the other major figure that was remembered, or the other major event, was the fall of Constantinople. And of course, that was very much remembered because they were living under the direct result of that. So, what I want to say is that when the people identify or call themselves identified as Romi or Romei, they didn't have the very much historical knowledge to illustrate or to elaborate on what that was, except that we are Orthodox. We speak Greek usually, even though in places there were Turkish-speaking people, Orthodox Christians, Romi, who in Asia Minor who spoke Turkish, or a mixed dialect like in Cappadocia. But being Orthodox is the most important thing. And why? Because of context. Because being Orthodox separated them from the Turks, who were Muslims. And that's why even if you were 100% ethnically Greek born and bred, if you convert to Islam, none of that mattered. You were now a Turk. And of course, legally, a lot of that was legal, but also um, in the conscience of the people. It wasn't just like a passport. And that's why context matters. If you go farther back, of course, obviously, if you go to pagan Rome, Orthodoxy has nothing to do with it, right? And that's why what it meant to be Roman has changed, and what it meant to be Greek or Hellene has also changed over the course of the centuries. These are not as static and as permanent as we would like to think today. So what happened in the Greek Revolution is that there was a total flip, a total switch, and from this Romaic terminology to a very Hellenic one in all the official documents, and eventually, and of course, in the education, and eventually that trickled down to the base of society, and now Elin is the standard name. But to understand why that happened, why at the revolution we essentially changed our name for all intents and purposes, and what that means in did that really change anything in essence? I think we need to go back. I think we need to go back to the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great, and start from there and move forward and see how the names and the meanings of Hellene and Roman and Greek have changed since then.
Hmm. I always knew people always say they tell me that it was the French Revolution that caused the downfall of society, but I always knew it was the death of Alexander the Great that caused the downfall of society.
Of course. I mean, if Alexander hadn't died, man, who knows what would have happened?
So true. It's too much. I cannot reveal. They told me through that I cannot say the great empire Alexander would have built from Europe to China.
It would have been a Eurasian, pan-Eurasian Hellenic Empire.
It's true. We
Well,
could have had this.
even without that, though, his influence was extremely widely felt. And I would argue uh, that the most important part was the language and the culture, too, of course. And it's well known that the Hellenistic world was a world that was very Hellenized. In language, everyone spoke Greek, and everyone assimilated to various degrees the Hellenic civilization, mostly in the cities, of course. In the countryside, in Syria, they still spoke Syriac. In Egypt, the peasants still spoke Coptic. Um, but of course, in the cities, in the urban centers, in the essentially Greek colonies, is what they were. Um, Greek was universally known. That's why many people think that even Jesus Christ, our Lord, spoke Greek to Pilate because he was from Galilee. But here's the thing though. In the Greek history books that I read growing up, everyone said that the Middle East, the Near East, Egypt was Hellenized. These people were assimilated into the Greek nation, especially in Asia Minor, which is where it matters most for us. Uh, these people were Hellenized and became Greeks because they adopted the Greek language, they adopted the Greek culture. Now, there's some problems with that. And one of them is that as late as the 1st century after Christ, when St. Paul is traveling in Asia Minor, he in Lycaonia, he comes to this town where of course, they understand Greek because he's speaking to them in Greek. But then when they get all excited and they think he's Zeus and Hermes, he's Hermes and Barnabas is Zeus, they start speaking in their Lycaonian language, Lycaonisti, it says in the New Testament, which shows that they also knew very well their own ancestral language before Alexander the Great conquered them, which had been 4 centuries earlier. So 4 centuries later, they still spoke it. And second, they still spoke it so much that when they got excited, they switched to Lycaonisti, which means that their knowledge of Greek, at least for most people, was not so deep. Think about it. Like you're a Greek American, right? And in many ways, I am too. But not the same way as you are. But if as a Greek American, you know Greek and you know English, and most Greek Americans or many Greek Americans know English better because that's what they went to school and all that. So, and they can communicate in Greek, but English they know it much better. So if you get all excited, whatever, with fear or joy and what comes out spontaneously is the language that you know best. And so the fact that they switched to Lycaonian shows that Lycaonian was still the predominant. That's what they spoke in their houses. Maybe not in the marketplace with foreigners, but definitely amongst themselves. And this was probably the case with other languages. So as late as the 1st century after Christ, which is 2 centuries after the Romans conquered Asia Minor, these people were not Hellenized in the sense that they were, as Greek as you and me.
That's so interesting. I've never even noticed that. Any of that you're saying, I had no idea about that. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, and so the question is, if they were not Hellenized in the 2.5 centuries of Hellenistic rule, which is when they were ruled by Greek or mostly Greek rulers, were they Hellenized when they were ruled by Romans? So later on, of course, in medieval history, you see these people of Asia Minor and of the Eastern Roman Empire call themselves Romans, not just Lycaonia, but general region. So it really looks like they were Romanized instead of Hellenized, at least in some way, because they didn't call themselves Hellenes, they called themselves Romans. They spoke Greek, of course. So it's a little more complicated than just, well, they spoke Greek, therefore they were as Greek as you and me. And the other thing is that I want you to consider this. You come to America, you know Greek. Most people don't. If Greek is your secret language, Greek is what sets you apart. You speak Greek with your family, you speak Greek with your Greek friends, and that's one of the things that keeps you Greek, along with the church and the culture and the Greek fests and that sort of thing. But if you go to, and also similar thing with Orthodoxy. So if you go to an Orthodox country, let's say you move to, I don't know, Russia, everybody's Orthodox, right? So being Orthodox does not preserve your Greekness, but speaking Greek does. In the inverse now, consider the Hellenistic world where everybody spoke Greek. So speaking Greek, if you were a true-born, 100% pure-blooded Greek from Sparta or Athens or Thebes or Corinth or Macedonia or Crete, and you went to Syria, you went to Lycaonia, you went to Alexandria, everybody speaks Greek. But not everybody is Greek, because a lot of them are Copts, Egyptians, Syrians, Lycaonians, Palestinians, but they speak Greek, some better, some worse, because they're merchants or because everybody, it's the lingua franca. And some of them, for some of them it is their native language, but they're still not Greek, in the sense that just like, you speak English, or many Greek Americans speak English, they're not descendants of the Plymouth colonists, right? So, but for this, for our hypothetical traveler, our Corinthian traveler in Alexandria, the Greek language does not avail him, does not help him, does not at all help preserve his Greekness, in contrast to these crowds of Egyptians who also speak Greek. What about Greek culture? Maybe his Greek culture will set him apart. Well, thanks to Alexander's conquests, tons of people, especially in the urban centers, are culturally also Hellenized. They dress like Greeks, they worship like Greeks, they go to Greek temples, Greek libraries. There's the gym culture, the gymnasiums, the races, the various athletic competitions that the Greeks engaged in, and famously, the Hebrews, for example, the Maccabees, did not wish to engage. And part of the reaction, if you read the book in the Old Testament, part of the reaction was because many Jews were getting assimilated, and part of that assimilation was engaging in gymnastic and athletic competitions, and these feasts. The cities had all these festivals to honor the gods. So these Greek cultural traditions are adopted and implemented throughout the Alexander's Hellenistic world. So that will not separate you either. What about religion? Well, there's a lot of syncretism. There's not a monotheistic religion, of course. This is pagan world, but there's a lot of syncretism. You have Greek friends back in Athens who maybe they worship. Well, this is a little later in the Roman Empire, but there were Eastern goddesses or gods like Mithras and Isis who were very popular among some circles in Greece and Italy. So, and also there's the analogies that, okay, I worship Zeus, but Zeus is really like the equivalent of this Egyptian god. So religion might help a little bit, but not that much. So in other words, by making the whole world, or the whole Hellenistic world, Hellenized, and Hellenizing the Eastern Mediterranean, you're not making these people Greeks, you're making it harder to be Greek, because the things that set you apart are now everybody's property. Do you see what I'm saying, Dilemma here?
Yeah. That's interesting. I've never heard it put that way before, but that's true.
Think about it like this. To have assimilation, you need to have a large quantity and a small quantity. And the large quantity will always absorb the small quantity. So picture this for a simulation. You have a pot of water, boiling water, and a pot of cold water. If you add a little cold water in the boiling water, the boiling water will not will the decrease in temperature will be negligible. The cold water will be assimilated to the heat. But if you add a ton of cold water, twice and three and four times the amount of cold water to the boiling water, the boiling water will just stop boiling. It will just get cold, turn cold. And that's how simulation works. The larger amount assimilates a smaller amount, not vice versa. Now, here in this case, it was a two-way exchange because all these populations, to a great degree, adopted Greek language and culture, but thereby the Greeks lost what set them apart. So we probably won't know exactly unless we have a time machine to go back and see exactly how it is. But it's, I think personally, I think that by the let's say 2nd century after Christ, in other words, 5 centuries after Alexander the Great, by the time of St. Paul, by the 1st century after Christ, even by the second, especially by the 2nd century after Christ, you should expect, given these things, you should expect to see a weakening of the Greek national identity because A, culturally and linguistically, you're not set apart anymore, and B, you're a part of the Roman Empire. So politically, you're not set apart either, because the political distinction also helps, you know. So how do we know this? And there is proof for this if you look at the texts, if you look at the dictionaries, because if you look at the word, look up the word Elin in an ancient Greek dictionary, there's the earliest use refers to a specific tribe in the Iliad, and then of course it's the use, the national use, the referring to the whole nation, of course. But later on, Elin is used by the Jews to refer to any non-Jew, which is to be expected. It's not, doesn't necessarily mean anything. Looking at the dictionary, this is specifically in the Little Scott Jones dictionary, but similar thing in other dictionaries. Let's see the definitions of Elin. First is the Thessalian tribe in the Iliad. And then second, of course, all Greeks, which is the way we use it today. The third definition, though, is Gentiles as opposed to Jews in the Old Testament. And the fourth definition, I think it's an Egyptian papyrus, is non-Egyptian, including Persians. So this shows that at least among some rural Egyptians, the Egyptians called any non-Egyptian Hellene, even if they were Persian. Which
strange.
Yeah, well, what you see is the rural, Copts versus the really cosmopolitan urban centers. And that's what I'm getting at, is that the Hellenic identity, cultural and linguistic, became a more cosmopolitan thing, not tied to a specific identifiable ethnic group that's here or not there, but referring to this almost in an ancient way, like an ancient version of globalization. You know how today you have, American culture becomes the currency of globalization. Coca-Cola and Hollywood movies and these pop songs become the currency of globalization. That's what Hellenic culture was back then. And of course, that has the effect to Americanize Greece today, for example, or Americanize the world, but it also detracts from the identifiableness of the original culture. So perhaps I wouldn't be surprised. How people say today, white people have no culture. I wouldn't be surprised if some Egyptian, shepherd boy who got into an argument with some Hellenistic schoolboys said, "Oh, Hellenes have no culture." Because anyway, you get the analogy. And then the fifth definition is pagan, as opposed to Christian. So we see that this word has become generalized to refer to a large group of people who are, of course, there are Greeks in there, but there are also non-Greeks. So whether it's Gentiles as opposed to Jews, or non-Egyptians as opposed to Egyptian, or pagan as opposed to Christian, it refers, it has a wider sense.
Mm.
And now what we aren't taught in school in Greece is that the last definition, that of pagan, is the definition that prevailed, at least in the Christian writings, in the church fathers, from St. Paul all the way to right before the Greek Revolution. If you take this Synaxarion that I have mentioned before, by St. Nicodemus, the Synaxarion of the 12 months, he multiple times refers to the pagans as Hellenes. As the Hellenes broke into the church and murdered this saint. Now, he's not saying that he's not Greek, but he's using the term Hellene to refer to pagan, because that's what all the church fathers and St. Paul and have been doing for 1,800 years. And they wouldn't have been able to do that if Hellene was still tied closely to a specific ethnic group, right? No, I can't say. Let me take an example. Like the Chechens in the Caucasus Mountains are Muslim, but it would make no sense for me to refer to all Muslims as Chechens. But it would make some sense to refer to all Muslims as Arabs. Why? Because Arabic is their official language, their sacred language, and they've all been, to a certain degree, Arabicized. And the original, it's harder to say who's the original Arab tribe of the desert and who's the Syrian, Arabicized Syrian, or the Arabicized Egyptian. So, and that I just saw this the other day in one of the books I was editing. The Greek editor who had worked in that book before me, he said that Celsus, an ancient Greek author, or ancient author, I should say, Celsus was either a Greek or a Roman. So it's unclear where was he. And many of these ancient authors are on that gray zone where it's unclear. They have a Roman name, but they were born in Greece perhaps, but they also have a Roman name. And so this is the part that I think most Greeks will get angry with me about, but it's not my fault. It's just what history shows. And the same on the other side, the same was happening to the Romans, because the Romans started out as a small city, and of course, Roman meant you're from my hometown. But then as they grew and they granted citizenship to conquered cities, and then they had colonies, and they took people from their neighborhood and they sent them farther afield in other parts of Italy. So very similar thing happened with Roman, except they happened much more slowly. Well, not much more slowly, but over a few more centuries than the Greek, than it happened with the Greek name. But Italy is indisputably the heartland of the Roman Empire, just as, of course, Greece is the heartland of the Hellenic Greek civilization. But the Greek civilization and the Roman Empire outgrew their cradles, outgrew their homelands. And so you could have Roman colonies in North Africa that were exact replicas of the lifestyle of Italy. There's not just all across the Roman Empire, but especially in the West, because the East was already civilized, Hellenized, and urbanized. So there was not as much need. But if you go to the city of Tamugadi in the deserts of Libya, or is it Tunisia? If you go to Philippi in northern Greece, if you go to York or Eboracum in England, if you go to all these abandoned ancient Roman colonies across the empire, east and west, mostly in the west, and the northern Balkans, keep that in mind, you will find the same. You will find organized cities, usually on a grid pattern. They have a forum, they have a theater, oftentimes a coliseum, they have gymnasiums, they have triumphant arches inscribed in Latin, honoring various military heroes. And it's the same thing. The parallels are fascinating and endless, but just like in America, wherever you go, there's a Walmart and and a Goodies and a McDonald's. Of course, the Roman version was a lot more epic. They had triumphant arches and gymnasiums instead of McDonald's. But it's a very similar thing that you could be in a or American suburbia. You could be in American suburbia in Phoenix, American suburbia in Chicago, and it's probably very similar, except that the climate is different. That's what it was in the Roman Empire, and uh, so a lot of these people were actually colonists. They were from Italy originally, but of course, you can imagine what happens over centuries when you've been in North Africa or you've been in Britain for centuries or Greece, and these two names, these two identities, Roman and Hellenic, follow very similar trajectories because they both outgrow and they encompass the whole world. In other words, the ecumeni, in other words, the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was very Hellenized. In fact, by the time they conquered Greece, 146 BC, also something we forget, Greece was already part of the Roman Empire or Republic for 1.5 centuries before Christ. By that time, the Romans, that's when Hellenization really took off, of course, because they had all these new Greek captive slaves, and whom they gave as tutors for their children. And now the next generation of Romans is speaking fluent Greek because of their Greek tutors. They're reading the Iliad, they're reading the Odyssey, they're translating these works into Latin, they're copying the Greek authors. And of course, each nation has its own gifts from God. So whereas the Greeks were more artistic, arguably, I would say, in Virgil says the same thing in the Aeneid, which is, again, the Aeneid is a fan fiction based on Iliad and the Odyssey. He says in the scene where Aeneas, the hero and the forefather of the Romans, legendarily, goes into the netherworld and he meets his father. His father prophesies and says, others will cast bronze statues more elegantly and will trace the course of the skies and will explore arithmetic and art and carve stone into beautiful forms. But you, Roman, your job is to rule, to beat down the proud and to spare the conquered. So that's how the Romans themselves saw it. That yes, the Greeks are better than us in the arts, but we are better at politics. And I think history proves them right, because Alexander the Great, and you could say this is also God's providence, but regardless, the Greeks invented democracy. The Athenians invented democracy, but democracy was only in Athens. It was never meant to expand. They never united. They were, in fact, I would say they were unable to unite, because the only time they were united is when Alexander the Great united them. And even then Sparta didn't join. And when Alexander died, his body was still hadn't get cooled, and they were killing each other, and his empire fractured. And the Greeks did not produce a unified, successful political system or organization, unified, that could expand and survive and dominate the way the Roman Empire did. So I think Virgil's right in this excerpt that the Romans' talent from God was, at least we're talking about the original Romans in Italy, was political, and they created a state, a res publica is what they called it, a republic. Another thing we don't know, they called it a res publica all the way, even to the very end, to the very dying day of the empire, which was so successful that it conquered an incredible swath of land, from Great Britain to Egypt. It's larger than any modern European country except for Russia, and it endured in that shape for 400 years, nay, almost 500 years, until the fall in 476. That's roughly 500 years. There were some border adjustments. Think about it. What other empires have there been in history that were of comparable size and also lasted comparable length of time? The Mongols, yeah, they conquered most of Asia, but they also fractured. Alexander the Great fractured. You could say the Chinese, maybe. But again, they had they had their warring states periods. They collapsed and rebuilt. Whereas the Roman Empire, um, okay, I think China is comparable, but overall, the Roman Empire lived longer, as even though it shrank, but it lived longer. The British Empire, of course, was huge and very well governed, but it didn't last 400 years. In fact, it's more like 150 to maybe 200 years. So the Roman Empire is unique in the history of the world for its length, for its longevity, and its stability. And in fact, even when it faced the hardest challenges, barbarians overrunning half of the empire or even more of the empire. When the Arabs took over the Middle East and North Africa, the empire lost 75% of its territory, and it still survived and even made a comeback. So there's something remarkably persistent, durable in this design, and it's not because of the ancient Greeks. It's because of the ancient Romans. I think, of course, the ancient Greeks were incorporated into it, and maybe we could say that the ancient Greeks were politically assimilated into the political framework. But we have to
Honestly,
recognize.
this might be the most controversial part of anything you've said today. Is just now when you said that Rome was great not because of the Greeks. That might that's
Well, in the political sphere. But here's the other side, though, that civilizationally, culturally, the Roman Empire was thoroughly Hellenized. When I say thoroughly, let me give you an example. You've heard the famous last words of Julius Caesar, "Et tu, Brute," right? You too, Brutus, as Brutus stabs him. Now, here's the thing that most people don't know. Those words are from Shakespeare in that form, in Latin, "Et tu, Brute." No Roman historian ever wrote down those words, "Et tu, Brute." In fact, One Life of Caesar does not mention them at all. The only life of Caesar that mentions them is by Suetonius. Only the historian Suetonius, in his life of Caesar, Julius Caesar, says he says according to some he didn't say anything, but according to others, he when Brutus stabbed him, he said Julius Caesar said, and then he switches to Greek. This whole book is in Latin. Then he switches to Greek in Greek letters and says, "Ke si technon," and you child. So if Caesar said anything as Brutus stabbed him, it was not et tu brute, it was "Ke si technon" in Greek. And there are other Greek quotes in the life of Julius Caesar and in other lives of other Caesars. So think about that. Is it because why would Caesar speak Greek? Why would Julius Caesar's last words be in Greek? Did he have that much composure and poetic inspiration that he decided to
aura.
speak aura? Or was it that he spoke Greek just as fluently as he spoke Latin? He was perfectly bilingual. Which one was it? That's how Hellenized the Greek Empire was. And of course, some Romans complained back in the second century before Christ, but history moved on regardless. And so I think it's a fair trade because we get the whole world becomes Hellenized, the whole Roman Empire becomes Hellenized, and when you get to the Byzantine Empire, so-called Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Roman Empire, continued. That's when you have, that's when Orthodoxy predominates, which started earlier, of course, with Constantine the Great. And then you have the Orthodox faith become an integral part of the identity of the Eastern Roman Empire in the later years. And again, context matters because what happens? That's when the Muslims take over. They're surrounded by, in the east and the south, by Islam and by heretics, the Monophysites, the Copts, the Nestorians, and finally when the Great Schism happens and the Fourth Crusade, that's when Orthodoxy really becomes synonymous, and of course the Ottoman Empire seals that deal. That's when Orthodoxy really becomes very very integrally part of it. But to see how we got here, I will point to two dates: 212 and 313. 212 is when Roman Emperor Caracalla grants Roman citizenship to every freeborn inhabitant of the empire. And 313 is when Constantine the Great issues the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity. So, interestingly, only a few years later, in the 320s or 330s, we get the first instance of the word Romania, which, as a Pontius, you know, Romania is the real name of Byzantium. It wasn't called Byzantium, it was called Romania. And where do we see the first instance of Romania? It's in a letter by St. Athanasius. It's a book by St. Athanasius the Great, who was in Egypt, against the Arians, the heretic Arians. And he says to the Arians, "You're so insolent, so shameless, that you have, after spreading your heresy throughout the whole ecumeny, inhabited world, in other words, Roman Empire, you have dared to assault even the city of Rome, which, don't you know that Rome is the metropolis, the mother city of Romania?" So we see two very interesting things here. Athanasius the Great, who was not from Italy, he's not like an old-timer heritage Roman from Italy. He's I don't know his ancestry, but he's from Alexandria. He's from this cosmopolitan environment. He calls Rome the mother city of Romania. He's not trying to deny the connection, as some Greeks want to do today. Say, "Oh well, we just call ourselves that, but we had no connection." It's just it's like trying to say, "Well, we have the same last name, but it's just a coincidence. We're not cousins." No, he acknowledges that's how it happened historically, and then we see the word Romania, and Romania is a very important word because it shows a change. Before, you had conquerors and conquered, Romans and subjects. And that's when we really speak of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire refers not to the Romans with respect to themselves, but to the Romans as in their relationship to the conquered. Because with respect to themselves, the Romans always called their state a respublica, or later in Greek, a politia, or politevma, which is another key word, which we see in hymns. But politevma and politia are translations of respublica. They always thought of themselves as a free people, like Americans today in many ways. But if we speak of empire, we speak of empire as regards the conquered. But Romania, spoken by a non-Italian, he was from Egypt, from Alexandria, shows that, and he didn't make up the word either. The fact that he uses it means that his audience was familiar with it. So already by the early or mid 4th century, this word is common and well known and used in a writing. It could have been 100 years earlier. It could have been in use from ever since Caracalla made everyone a Roman citizen in 212. Who knows? We'll never know. But it shows that, and officially, regardless of when the word was used, officially with Caracalla, in 212, the conquered are no longer conquered. The conquered are now citizens. The conquered are now citizens. And the empire of the Romans is now the country of the Romans. That's what Romania means. Romania is just like Germania is the country of the Germans. The ancient authors wrote of Rothia, Rothia was not a place. It was wherever the Goths were living, whether it was Crimea or Romania or later Spain, or wherever the Goths migrated. So Romania is the country of the Romans. And so these two shifts, the first is that the conquered are no longer conquered. They are fellow citizens. And of course, that included the Greeks. The Greeks of Greece, of Asia Minor, wherever they were, especially Greece, they were now Roman citizens. And if you were growing up in Corinth, I'll bring you as an example Plutarch, the ancient Greek author. He was from Stadia Lava. He was very close to Delphi. He was a priest there for a while, as Greek as you can get. And yet, he was born in the mid-1st century after Christ, so 2 centuries after the Roman conquest of Greece. And he wrote the parallel lives, comparing Greek great politicians and Roman political figures, comparing and contrasting them. Very valuable source, primary source. And what that shows, and he was honored by with Roman citizenship. He was given Roman citizenship later in life, and he received the Roman name Lucius Mestrius Plutarchus. So he has a Greek name and a Latin name. He's given Roman citizenship, but he's a Greek priest in Delphi. He's writing the lives of Greek great men like Pericles, but also Roman great men like Julius Caesar. So, and this is the first century after Christ. This is, we're not talking about the second or the third. So imagine how much more. So it's not that the ancient Greeks, of course, they didn't deny their Greekness, but uh, growing up in the Roman Empire, the political differences of the past are very old news. The bitterness following the conquests, the Roman conquest, is 2 centuries in the past, and this empire is not here to oppress you. It's not like the Ottoman Empire. Can you imagine if the Ottoman Empire had became Orthodox? Let's say I wouldn't even say religiously tolerant. The Ottoman Empire officially adopted. You had a sultan who has a vision of the cross and becomes Orthodox, and slowly, of course, he doesn't burn, explode mosques the next day, but slowly, the Ottoman Empire becomes more and more Orthodox, and they use Greek. They use your language, Greek, for much of their political administration, and you're free. You're not oppressed. You're not a second class citizen. You don't have to wear black because only Muslims can wear colored clothes. You don't have to pay exorbitant taxes or send your sons to become janissaries. But it's a very as countries go, it's a very good place to live. You have political opportunities. You're a citizen. The whole country speaks your language and believes in your faith. Would it make sense to hold on to? And now I'm talking about ancient Greece now. I mean Plutarch. Would it make sense as a young man growing up in Greece as part of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century after Christ or 1st century after Christ? Would it make sense to say, "Oh, you conquered us in 146 BC. I don't want to play." This is like a silly childish thing to do to keep grudges like that. It's not serious. It's not mature. So and it doesn't really make sense because now if there was a religious difference, if there was some kind of oppression, which there was in places like Egypt, for example. Egypt was never fully assimilated. Syria was never fully assimilated. Why? Because their language and their culture were not adopted. Syriac or Coptic and their whatever, and they had a civilization. They had the pyramids, for goodness sakes. They could walk down and look up and see the pyramids and say, "That's what our ancestors built." The peoples that were fully assimilated are either the ones who did not have a significant history or culture, like the people in Asia Minor. They had something, like there's the Hattusha, or what's it called, the ancient city, the Hittite city, but nobody even knows the history of that place, and it's not as impressive as anything. Not as impressive as the pyramids. So people who didn't have much of a history or didn't know their history, they didn't have a significant language and especially a religious difference, because later on the Egyptians became Monophysites, as did the Syrians, even though that might have been partly for ethnic reasons because of their pre-existing ethnic grudge. But the Greeks didn't have that because they had no reason to have a grudge because their civilization, their culture, their language was celebrated and promoted and endorsed by the empire of which they were now a part. And so it made no sense for them to stay out of the game, for them to say, "I don't want to participate." And so many of them entered the political life, the cultural life. There's a good excerpt that summarizes this shift very well in the book Greek, A History of the Language and Its Speakers by Jeffrey Horrocks. I read that from my theological school in Thessaloniki. Unfortunately, my copy is in Greece, so otherwise I'd read to you. But in very succinctly, in 2 pages, he summarizes what I'm trying to say here. And so, contrary to popular opinion, the Hellenization of the world, of the ecumeni, in other words, was the factor that helped the Greeks assimilate, not the other way around. And the Greeks, it was easier for the Greeks than easier for them than for anyone else. It was easier for them than for anyone else to assimilate into the Roman Empire because the Roman Empire was opening the door for them by Hellenizing itself. Look at Roman architecture. It's just a copy with some alterations of Greek architecture. Roman temples are just Greek temples on a grander scale. And the only places in the empire that were not fully Romanized, from what we can tell, are, as I said, places that had a pre-existing strong identity, linguistic, archaeological, historical, like Egypt and Syria, or places that were very remote, like Brittany in France, or the mountains of Spain, like the Basque people who still speak their pre-Indo-European language, because they were so remote. But everyone else, and the Greeks, of course, did not fall in either of these categories, and so that makes sense. This explains why the term Hellene could take on this ecumenical meaning, this meaning of uh, this cosmopolitan, so to speak, meaning, and be used later, be used to refer to originally non-Jews and then or non-Egyptians, and then later on to non-Christians, and that's how it's used. Hellene is used in all the ecclesiastical writings to mean pagan. Now there is an exception, and that is in the scholarly writings later on in Constantinople, in the medieval period, and not just throughout. This was a constant throughout history. In the scholarly philosophical writings, Hellene kept its sense as ancient Greek, not in the pagan sense, but in the cultural, civilizational sense. The ancient Greeks, Hellenes also meant ancient Greeks, not just pagans. Like if you were referring in ordinary speech, if you were referring to Hellenes in the Eastern Roman Empire in the Middle Ages, if you were referring to them as like living people down the road, it meant pagans. But if you said the Hellenes in the past, everyone understood the ancient Greeks. Think about that. We say, I learn, and this ties in with the language. You brought it up earlier. When we speak of Latin, to this day, we just say Latin. We don't say ancient Latin. Why? Because there's no modern Latin. What happened to modern Latin? It became different languages. Spanish, Italian. No one calls Italian modern Latin. But that was exactly how it was with Greek. In the Middle Ages, when somebody referred to the language as Hellenic in the Greek speaking context, Elliniki, glossa, it referred to ancient Greek, which was the official language, of course, or Attic, it could be called Attic. But the ordinary speech they called it, colloquially, they called it Romaica, or slightly more formally, Romaica or Romaica, of course, same thing. And that entered the English language. There's the adjective Romaic, which honestly, that's what we should be using instead of Byzantine. Instead of Byzantine chant, we should be saying Romaic chant. It's a very good term because Romaic, it's very good because it keeps the Roman root, but it also has the Greek suffix, not Roman. The an is a Latin suffix. It's a Greek suffix, Romaic. So it's perfect to deliver that sense of Greco-Romanness, so to speak.
That's so
But
interesting, actually. Yeah, you know what? Maybe I'm gonna start saying that actually, because you're right. That is a good. That is something that's good. Hey,
make it
I
go
actually you made me wait. Or go ahead.
make it go viral.
Yeah. Here we go. Starting now, we're making it viral. You actually reminded me. I wanted to ask you. One of the things you made me think of was the Alexiad,
Hmm.
by it was Anna Kamnini. Because in there, I don't know if you know about this. I assume you do. She refers to Elines at one part, when she talks about she's saying that in Constantinople you can find Hellenes studying ancient Greek.
Mm.
So at least in that uh, text, and this is later. This is like in the 11th century, so kind of late in the time period. But she's talking about Hellenes as if they're like around her, but then studying the ancient language, like we were talking about, and that's what you reminded me of, and that's one of the main examples that I think of when people talk about the idea of whether there was a Hellenic identity at all in Eastern Rome. Uh, that's one of the texts that I think of
Mm.
when people have this conversation.
There are, yes, I'm aware of that quote. I can't recall it verbatim in my mind, so I will refrain from commenting directly on it because I don't want to misremember it. But honestly, we could have a whole stream just collecting quotes from original sources and the most commonly cited ones, and looking at each one and seeing what's the context, where it came from. And context, as I said, is very important. But the Hellenic identity as an ancient Greek identity, specifically tied to ancient Greece, is was preserved among the scholars, among the intellectuals, and in fact, occasionally even there was a John Italus, a philosopher, who delved into that so much he tried to create his own philosophical system, and he was condemned as a heretic. But there was this bipolarism between the intellectuals, this polarity between the intellectuals and the common people, or the ordinary people, which you see also in modern Greece, with Katharevousa and Dimotiki, which, by the way, that's what they also called it. They called it uh, when they didn't call it Romaic, they called it Demotic, or our simple dialect, or something like that. So on the one hand, you have the intellectuals who are reading ancient Greek books all the time, because it is a fact that they did lose touch with Latin after a certain point, even though in the early Byzantine period, definitely in Justinian's time, and also of maybe a century or two later, they still refer to Latin as their ancestral language. Just when Justinian compiled the laws, most of them were compiled in Latin, but then one of the books was compiled in Greek. And it says in the preface that we have compiled this book in Greek so that it can be more, we have translated it from our ancestral language into Greek so that it can be more widely understood. So it's very interesting, of course, to surprising. Another thing, speaking of ancestors, is that many of the leading families of Constantinople had come from Rome originally. When Constantine relocated, many of the rich families followed him, right? Because they follow where the power is, where the money is, where the if you're a it's almost like your job. If you're a politician or if you're a senator, in Constantinople. Let's speak of Constantinople. Constantinople had a senate. It had a hippodrome. It really was a new Rome, and also in a political sense. But that's something to explore another time. But they did lose touch with Latin. They stopped learning Latin in their school curriculums, except for a very small number of scholars. And that's why they called the Westerners later, when they came into contact with the Crusaders, they called them the Latins, because they spoke either Latin or a Romance language. So there was something lost. When we say that the Byzantines were Romans, they were not Romans in the same way that even Julius Caesar, or even Constantine the Great, or Justinian. Justinian had very much that ancient Roman vision of a unified empire, including Rome. He really, he spoke Latin. But later emperors, especially after the loss of the Balkans, they don't speak Latin.
I did actually. I thought of a question. Um, if I could ask it to you, because
Yeah.
the idea, what you're saying with how Greek culture expanded a lot, and so then they almost lost touch with their own Hellenism because suddenly everyone could speak Greek, everyone understood Greek culture and could participate in it. And same you were saying with Rome, how it changed, where there was an original like Roman people native to the city, and then all of Roman culture expanded. And so then it became more difficult to be unique, I guess, and to be
Mm.
in touch with your own self, your own ethnic self, basically. So in a way, on the one hand, we would say that it's good to be capable of expanding into an imperial power or to be able to assert your cultural influence. But on the other hand, it seems that once you do that, that's when you start to essentially lose touch with yourself. And
Yes.
so, in a way, almost couldn't you say that that's an argument in favor of nationalism? Because, and that's why it's good for people to preserve their own identity as opposed to trying to either completely get rid of identities or to like have some type of imperial thing where just you spread your own idea to everywhere so that everyone's like you,
Hmm.
because when that happens then you start to lose it. So instead it's better to preserve your own people and then
Yeah.
everyone else also does the same thing, and that way everything's preserved. And in a I guess you could say the beauty of God's creation, which is all these various types of peoples around the world, that gets preserved
Of course.
because they're doing that.
Of course. Empire building is a double-edged sword, and the you can see that throughout history. You can see it today with the spread of English. The internet for English speakers is a free for all. Whereas if let's say if you speak Latvian, there's only about 2 million people, 2 million Latvian speakers in the world max. So the Latvian internet is a very private space, as opposed to the English internet, which anybody virtually, almost anybody in the world could be on there, and there's no privacy, so to speak, from outsiders. Yeah, empire building is a double-edged sword, and so in a sense, when the empire lost a lot of the territories, at least in the south, on the one hand, it was tragic because all these great cities, Antioch, Alexandria, which were very important, have been very important to the empire, were lost. On the other hand, though, there was a plus side, which was that the empire consolidated, and these regions which had had large non-assimilated, non-Greco-Roman populations, in other words, Syrians, Egyptians, were lost, and there and was left with Asia Minor and Greece, really, not even the whole Balkans. And these two territories, especially Asia Minor, proved the beating heart and heartland of for the rest of the empire's history until the Seljuks. But um, this this brings us really to the start of a modern Greek history, because Greek revolution, of course, starts in what is now Greece, and Asia Minor. We are intricately connected to Asia Minor. Many of our ancestors came from there after the Asia Minor catastrophe. And so I want to say this, that we know who we are. We are a people. Anything, do not take anything I have said here today as saying that it's trying to undermine our nationhood. It's trying to say that we're not a real nation or a real people or whatever. We've always been diverse or anything like that. There is a very specific identifiable people forged through all this history, through all these trials, through all this historical fermentation, so to speak. And the three main ingredients that formed us are the Greek civilization and culture, literary culture, architecture, art, everything, Roman political infrastructure system, the body, so to speak, and the Christian faith. So if we compare to a human body, to a man, and the fathers usually say that there's body, soul, and spirit, and we could say that, well, depending how you understand it, but the Roman Empire is the body. The Roman element is the body. The Greek element is the spirit, in the sense of the intellectual aspect. The spirit, as in the spirit of man, is what this so-called the spiritual life, in the sense of intellectual life. We see that in modern Greek, πνευματική. Anyway, that's the Greek civilization, and the Orthodox faith is our soul that gives life to the whole body. If you take out the soul, it all dies. If you take away orthodoxy, neither our Greekness nor our Roman slash, if you want to say Byzantine, will take us anywhere. And so the Roman name, Romios, predominated because that was the name of the body, which is what you see. But I argue that the Greek element is just as important, if not more important, because it's what defines who are you, right? Yes, you have this body, but what's your character? What's your traits? What are your interests? That's more of your spirit. That's the Greek element. And then finally, the Orthodox element, of course. So our people, our nation, whether we call it Hellenes, whether we call it Romi, we're talking about the same thing now, today. It is the same thing. Originally, it wasn't. Originally, the ones were in Athens and the others were in Italy. But today, there is an identifiable people. And just the fact that we were formed from elements that came from different sources does not mean that, oh, nothing matters. Let's just open our borders and let's see what happens. That's not how recipes work. Just throw random things in a pot. Where this matters for us today, is that we have to recognize that we are all three of these things. And the harm comes when we try to isolate the one from the other. And in our modern Greek context, it usually only goes one way. I've never heard of a modern Greek nationalist or patriot trying to reject the Greek element in favor of the Roman element, unless you think that's what I'm doing, which I'm not. I'm just emphasizing the Roman element because it's always neglected, it's always ejected. Instead, what we see is that ever since the Greek Revolution, there is this very strong Hellenizing tendency in an anti-Roman way. And where this comes from, of course, is twofold. Yes, part of it comes from the West, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the West always hated the East ever since Charlemagne, ever since we told them that they're not real Roman emperors. Their Holy Roman Empire is just a fake imitation. It's not a real deal. They've always had a grudge against us. And after the Fourth Crusade, we've had a big grudge against them too. So they called us Greeks originally. Now I'm all over the place here. I apologize, but the original use of, I'll circle back to the Greek, but they loved ancient Greece because of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, but the West hated Byzantium, quote unquote. That's why they called it Byzantium and not Roman Empire. And our intellectuals came back to Greece after the Greek Revolution. That's what I said at the beginning of the stream. And they, partly because they were brainwashed, frankly, by the West, partly because they wanted to please the West, and it was politically expedient to have the West favorable. Otherwise, they could just betray us. We were to a certain degree at their mercy in 1830. If they hadn't tolerated us, at least they could have allowed the Ottomans to just try to squash us indefinitely. So it was important politically to have international recognition, and it is realistic to say that if we had tried to style ourselves Politia Romeon, Res Publica Romana, and style our king as Emperor of the Romans, there's a very high chance the West would have sanctioned us or boycotted us or I don't know what. But then there's the third, and then the third source, though, that's not often recognized, is that our intellectuals had always been Hellenizing, even during, in the Alexiad, even during the High Byzantine period, the middle period, even at the height of the empire, you see Julian the Apostate, the prime example of a Hellenist. He loves the even though he's a from the line of Saint Constantine. He's a nephew of Saint Constantine. He's not Athenian. He's not Spartan, but he loves the culture so much that he calls himself a Hellene, and intellectuals, in other words, people who were reading their books all day long, and their books were ancient Greek. They were living in this ancient Greek mind world. They were always Hellenizing, and so it's unsurprising that for this reason, because scholars were always Hellenizing, because the West was very pro ancient Greece, and because it was politically expedient, Hellene became the official name of our country and our people after the Greek Revolution. But on top of that, there has been a very strong effort to it's not just that we used it because we had no other choice. We had to use it politically. It's that much more than that. There was a conscious effort to try to erase whatever Romaic there was. The first Greek history, the first history of Greece that they tried to write, completely skipped the Byzantine period. According to Corais was held up as a teacher of the Yenos, a teacher of the race, is famous for saying that we were conquered, we Greeks, and he called us Greeks too. He was so brainwashed that he didn't even call us Hellenes. We Greki were conquered first were conquered by the Turks, before that by the Byzantines, before that by the Romans, and before that by the Macedonians. It was so. That's how hardcore Attic Greek he was, classical Greek.
How strange. I've never known. I knew part of that. I didn't know the Macedonian part.
Mm-hmm.
That's
so
weird.
Think though, just as today we it's revolting for us to hear that quote. What, you're saying the Macedonians aren't Greek? And yet, many of these early, Hellenizers, as they call them, rejected the Macedonians too. So it's the same thing with the Romans and the Byzantines in many ways, because they were trying to reject a part of our history. They were trying to change our language from Romaica to this very rigid, classicizing Katharebusa, which has its positives. I like fancy language personally, but you're cutting off the living tradition, and especially as Orthodox, we are really into big living tradition, and they're trying to cut it off, and reconnect us like over the rainbow with a airborne bridge back to Pericles in classical Athens. And that's the really harmful thing for us. That's where it matters for us today, and it matters for our national interests too. Not just because culturally, when you go to a Greek fest, traditional dances, traditional clothes, you think that's from Pericles? You think that's from ancient Athens? That's Romaic. That's Romiosini. That's who we've been. That's how we've lived and breathed for the last 1,500 years. And that's not from Pericles. I mean, I'm not saying that it's un-Greek. No, it's Greek, but it's the living evolution of our people. So if I were commissioned to write a national history, let's say the Marble Emperor comes back, and he asks me to write a national history of our people, what I would do is the following. I would start our history. I would probably start our history somewhere around the time of Christ, or maybe Saint Constantine. And before that, I would have a lot before that. Of course, I would have a volume or two before that. But that would be like a prehistory. I would give the ancient Greek prehistory. I would also give the ancient Roman prehistory, and of course, I would say the Old Testament too. But I mean, the Old Testament would be taught anyway because it's faith class. I would give the prehistory and say these two streams converged to create something great. They converged with orthodoxy to create Romania. In our country, I would say our country is Romania. Now, that's not to say that's not to denigrate the Greek element. The Greek element is just as important. Let me see it like this: you have your first and your last name, right? You have two parents, your father and your mother. So you have your father's last name. Does that mean that you're rejecting your mother's side? Does that mean that your relatives on the mother's side you don't love them at all, or does that mean that your mother's contribution was not equally as important? I mean, some might say that the mother's contribution is in some ways more important because your whole body, your whole tissue and blood came from her, and children are oftentimes more emotionally tied to their mothers in many ways. But your last name comes from your father. That's how it is. That's how the convention. So that's how it is. That's how I see it personally. You can disagree. You can debunk me if you want, but I'm just presenting you how I see it. And this is Father John Romanidis says it. He uses this example: our father the Roman, and our father the Roman, and our mother the Hellene. And that's how it is. And so, in many ways, some of your most tender childhood memories are with your mother. And our mother is Hellas, our mother is Greece. But at the same time, if that's what we want to do, unless we want to go on a different path, we want to try to keep going on the path that we've been going on for the last 100 years, exclusively Hellenocentric, and overlooking, or God forbid, actively denying that part of us, because it's a part of us. This is part of our history. This is who we are. For better, for worse, it's like in the history of a family, you have generations and generations, and history moves on. We're not living in 500 BC, and I'm not saying we should honor that history. We should remember that history. We should rebuild the Acropolis if you want. I'd love to do that, but I think it's detrimental for us for our self-knowledge. What did the ancient Greeks say? Know thyself. So if we want to be like them, we should follow their advice, and we should know ourselves. And I should have mentioned this a lot earlier, but there's so much to say. But Rome itself was, from its very early days, was in very close contact with Greek colonies in southern Italy. And in fact, Rome was, based on some ancient Greek sources, Rome was seen as a half barbarian city, not a truly barbarian city. There's an ancient Greek author, I forget his name, I did some research on this years ago, who referred to Rome as a Hellenic city. He says, the Gauls, I heard of the Gauls, the Celts, came down and destroyed a Hellenic city called Roma. And I actually delved into this very much years ago, and this is another fascinating topic, because according to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, he wrote a series of books called Roman Antiquities, and he says his first book is on the origins of Rome, and in his day there were many different theories, because of course everyone was wondering, who are these people who have conquered the whole world? And that's what he's trying to show. And he says the different theories, this and that. But he says, according to the oldest and most trustworthy Roman historians, the earliest ancestors of the Roman people were settlers who came from the Peloponnesus 17 generations before the Trojan War. Have you heard this before?
This one I haven't heard this.
17 generations. We're talking deep into the Mycenaean period. We're talking early Mycenaean period, 16th or 17th century before Christ. And I did this. I got really into this. We could do a whole show on this, so I won't say much. But if you compare Mycenaean Greek from when we reconstructed, when we found inscriptions, in many ways it's closer. Latin is closer to Mycenaean Greek than Attic is to
Hmm,
Mycenaean.
it's interesting. I haven't heard that, but you reminded me of a lot of the, and you sort kind of like alluded to this before, but how the Romans were from Troy.
Hmm.
Like Romulus and Remus were descendants of Trojan refugees, and the Trojans themselves are also kind of an almost Greek people. So that's what I always think. That's what I expected you to say, but then you threw me for a loop. You threw me for a curveball because this other one I haven't heard about this other theory, but I think either way, whichever one we take, it becomes clear that there is some kind of idea that like they're not just the same as all other Varvari. There's something else. There's something that's
Yes,
almost Greek.
yes, and I think maybe we should talk more about this. Uh, maybe this is the spoonful of sugar that will help the medicine go down. I don't
Yes,
know.
maybe this is a good cliffhanger right here to say. Want to learn more? Wait till next time when we unlock the secret mysteries of the Romans or Greeks.
Yes, I will say one last thing, and with that, to intensify the cliffhanger, is that the Roman element in our identity, regardless of what our official name is, because we can only have one official name, but the Roman element is essential, is quintessential for any political claims we might have on not just Asia, even Thrace, but especially Asia Minor and any Near Eastern lands. I'll leave it at that.
It's true and real. Well, this has been. I was gonna say this has been a good conversation, but honestly, and I mean this in a positive way, I almost feel like I was at a lecture. It brought me back to my undergrad days because you speak very well. I think I learned quite a few new things, and hopefully the audience, I'm sure, will agree. Um, so yeah, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Gregory, for coming on and for educating us. And I look forward to having future conversations with you. And I hope this has been enjoyable for the audience. And I'd love to see feedback or comments or anything. Um, and after we leave it there until the next one.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this will produce a lot of engagement for the algorithm.
I'm sure we can clip it and we can put your most controversial statements and we'll put it on Instagram and then we'll get 10,000 comments of people attacking you. Yeah, attacking you.
There you go. It's been a pleasure, Tilamaki. Thank you for having me on.
Of course, of course. Thanks for coming.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you as well. Christ is ascended. Are
From
we
earth
supposed
to
to still
hell.
say that?
We can, yeah. It's until Friday, I think. Until tomorrow.
There we go.
All right.
Awesome.
Till next
Excellent.
time.
Yes, until next time.